Welcome, Facebook friends and family, to this week's Bible Topics discussion. Today, we're continuing our talk about the spiritual gifts in part 3 of the series. The gifts are discussed in Romans 12, 1 Corinthians 12 and 14, and Ephesians 4. We've covered Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians 12. Today we're looking at 1 Corinthians 14. But before we go there, some of you may be wondering why we skipped 1 Corinthians 13. Let's go to the end of chapter 12 and read all of verse 31, which is the last verse in the chapter. It says, "Eagerly desire the greater gifts, and now I will show you the most excellent way." 1 Corinthians 13 is sometimes called the love chapter. In this chapter, Paul the Apostle picks 4 gifts as examples. They are tongues, prophecy, faith, and giving. He declares that even these most spectacular gifts, when used, mean nothing unless motivated by love. Basically, Paul is telling us that if we don't have love, then the gifts mean nothing. It's a short chapter. Why don't you read it?
Well, moving on to 1 Corinthians 14. It starts off similarly to how chapter 12 ends. Verse 1 says, "Follow the way of love and eagerly desire spiritual gifts, especially the gift of prophecy." And then Paul begins talking about tongues and prophecy. Let's look at the definition of tongues given in part 2 of this series. Speaking in different kinds of tongues is the ability, number 1, to speak to God in a language they have never learned, and or, number 2, to receive and communicate an immediate message from God to his people through a divinely anointed utterance in a language they have never learned. Interpretation of tongues is the ability to make known the message of one who speaks in tongues so that the hearers can understand and be edified. Number 1 in the definition could be called a private tongue, also referred to as prayer language, praying in the Spirit, or singing in the Spirit. The second part of the definition could be called a public tongue, used in the church to build up the body.
So when you read 1 Corinthians 14, be mindful of the 2 parts of speaking in different kinds of tongues, and don't get confused. Even today, many Christians, when talking to someone about different kinds of tongues, have a hard time explaining it. Therefore, tongues are either a prayer language or a message from God given in a language that they do not know. Let's go a little deeper. Verse 2 says, "For anyone who speaks in a tongue does not speak to men, but to God. Indeed, no one understands him. He utters mysteries by his Spirit." This meets part 1 of the definition, a private language between you and God. It is hard to believe that this kind of tongue will build you up, but speaking personally, it builds me up.
Paul then continues discussing prophecies and how they speak to men for their strengthening, encouragement, and comfort. He further states that he who prophesies edifies the church. In verse 5, Paul states that he would like everyone to speak in tongues, but he would rather have us prophesy. But then he goes on to say that he who prophesies is greater than one who speaks in tongues, unless he interprets, so that the church may be edified. This meets part 2 of the definition. Looking at verse 12, it says, "So it is with you. Since you are eager to have spiritual gifts, try to excel in gifts that build up the church." Verses 24 and 25 say, "But if an unbeliever or someone who does not understand comes in while everybody is prophesying, he will be convinced by all that he is a sinner and will be judged by all, and the secrets of his heart will be laid bare. so he will fall down and worship God, exclaiming, God is really among you.
Wow, that is awesome. Well, to finish up the chapter, Paul continues to talk about orderly worship. He gives instructions for those speaking in tongues with interpretation and those who prophesy. In his instructions, Paul states that 2, or at most 3, should speak in tongues, one at a time, and someone must interpret. He also states that 2 or 3 prophets should speak, and the others should weigh carefully what is said. The chapter ends with verses 39 through 40 saying, Therefore, my brothers, be eager to prophesy, and do not forbid speaking in tongues. But everything should be done in a fitting and orderly way. Speaking for myself, I love praying in the Spirit and singing in the Spirit privately. Currently, I do not have the tongue for use in the church, and I pray for the gift of prophecy.
Well, that's today's discussion. Again, please like, comment, and share. And always, if you have questions, you can private message us. Please come back next week as we cover part 4, the last of the series.
See you next week. Be blessed.